Hi, now we're going to look at sentencing statutes. There are three different approaches to criminal sentencing statutes. The first model is indeterminate sentencing statutes. The second model is determinate sentencing statutes. And the third type is the guideline approach. Different states employ different statutes to their criminal code for sentencing offenders. One of the things that the legislatures throughout the United States and the federal government are concerned with is sentencing disparity. Sentencing disparity has been studied by legislators, by governors, by presidents, and there have been results that have found that individuals are sentenced disproportionately for the same types of crimes. So this is one issue that confronts legislators when they determine what type of sentencing statute they will employ. We will first look at indeterminate sentencing statutes. Indeterminate sentencing statutes are passed by the legislature, and the criminal offense for which the offender is going to be sentenced has a minimum time that they must serve and a maximum time that they must serve for their offense. So for instance, states that employ indeterminate sentencing for, let's say, the crime of assault would work like this. The defendant must be sentenced to a period of incarceration between 1 to 3 years. So the minimum that person would serve would be 1 year, and the maximum being 3 years. The judge may sentence that offender to anything between 1 year and 3 years. And the sentence is supposed to take into account the individual rehabilitative needs for that sentence to be imposed. The judge has a wide discretion between those periods of time to determine what a person should be sentenced to. Once the offender is then sentenced by the judge and incarcerated, there is a way that the defendant can be released to parole. The parole board during that period of incarceration examines the person's history while incarcerated and looks at things such as the person's behavior while incarcerated and can afford good time credits for the defendant's earlier release, and also looks at what has the offender done to rehabilitate him or herself while they've been incarcerated. Have they taken advantages of any programs? Have they taken advantage of job training that's afforded to them while incarcerated? These are things that the parole board will consider whether or not to release the offender early. This model has been criticized by some experts as being soft on crime. The indeterminate system has not been done away with in all states. Some states continue to use this model. So the theory is based on one of rehabilitation rather than a punitive model. And has been criticized as being too soft and not severe enough to punish criminal behavior. So in the early 80s, and actually from the mid-70s to the 80s, many states shifted from the indeterminate sentence guidelines or statutes to a determinate sentencing statute. A determinate sentencing statute prescribes the criminal punishment for an offense. So, for instance, the same assault, a felony assault here in Connecticut, assault in the second degree is a Class D felony, punished by up to 5 years in jail. Now, the judge can sentence that person to any period of incarceration up to 5 years in jail. The judge does have discretion to determine the amount of particular period of time of that incarceration. But his discretion or her discretion is limited to that period of incarceration. Second of all, determinate sentences have taken away discretions of parole boards. Although there is still a way for defendants to be released earlier than their period of incarceration if they are a violent offender, according to a bill that was passed in 1994, unless the state wished to waive receipt of federal dollars for criminal justice, a violent offender has to serve at least 85% of his or her sentence before they may be released. Now, this takes discretion away from the judge and gives prosecutors much greater control over sentencing. How does it do that? Well, prosecutors can make their decisions to charge an individual based on the period of incarceration that is available to the particular crime in which the prosecutor is going to charge that person with. The second thing that many determinate sentence statutes provide for are the use of mandatory minimum sentencing laws. Mandatory minimum sentencing laws have been very controversial. These types of sentencing statutes, determinate sentencing, are much more punitive in nature than are the indeterminate sentences. For instance, with the mandatory minimum sentences, based on a person's criminal history, they may receive mandatory period of incarceration. Also, certain drug-related crimes, such as sale of drugs, carry mandatory minimum sentences when they are combined with sale within a 1,500 feet range of schools. Now, these particular statutes contribute greatly to prison overcrowding issues and are highly controversial because of the way that they are applied many times to offenders living in cities. Most cities, you could throw a baseball to a school within an area where an arrest occurs, whereas in suburban and rural areas, there aren't those numbers of schools, so there aren't those number of restricted zones where individuals can be sentenced to mandatory prison time. So these statutes have been shown to be racially based and more heavily applied to minorities than non-minorities. They also prescribe the type of drugs sometimes that face mandatory minimum sentencing, especially in the federal system. Crack cocaine, which was mainly a drug that was bought and sold within a city, carried mandatory minimum sentences and longer periods of incarceration. So these particular types of crimes and sentencing statutes have been challenged on race grounds and the fact that they're not applied appropriately and result in racial discriminatory practices that violate the 14th Amendment. Also, many of the determinate sentencing statutes include three-strike laws, where if individuals have three felonies, the punishment can range from a much longer prison sentence up to and including life imprisonment. And the result of that has also played a significant role in prison populations and overcrowding, and in fact have been criticized for longer prison sentences of individuals who are not violent, and by filling prisons up with nonviolent offenders, it reduces the availability of beds for individuals who are violent. So that's the difference between determinate and indeterminate sentencing. One is much more punitive. The other one, indeterminate sentencing, based on rehabilitative measures and goals. The third type is the guideline approach. The guideline approach was first used by the federal government and is still used by the federal government and has been adopted in many states. And the goal for enacting these guidelines, these sentencing guidelines, were to reduce the sentence disparities. The way that the guideline system works, and we will examine it in another module later in the course, is that a graph is set up. And on one side of the graph is individuals, characteristics, age of the offender, the particular type of offense they have been either convicted or sentenced for, and their criminal history. And where the crime and the individual characteristics come in contact with each other on a graph is a sentence that has to be imposed. Now, some states that have enacted this particular type of statute allow for the judge to deviate from that guideline number, and the judge must state on the record what the aggravating or mitigating circumstances are that led him or her to deviate from the guideline. One thing that it did was it took away discretion from federal judges. On the federal side, they've also done away with parole and early release of offenders, and that's been criticized both by federal judges and by a committee that re-examines those federal sentencing guidelines. So those are the three types of sentencing statutes that have a direct impact on the criminal justice system, not just on the prosecution, but more importantly on the individual fairness implications, and also the large number of persons that are incarcerated in our country. In all of the civilized countries, we have the highest level of incarceration anywhere. So sentencing disparity is a very, very heavily studied topic, and one that we will deal with in this course. Thank you.